youngsters. Great chance here! That does it! Steve McGavin! And for the first time, Colchester United have won a major final.
Still Garcia, finally the company arrives and it's in! It's a freak-out goal from Ricardo Carvalho. Richard Garcia wants the credit and the shock is on at the bridge.
And it's promotion for Colchester United. They've made it into the Championship for the first time in 69 years.
Porter, being held. There is Porter, and that's Maka!
Welcome to Beyond The Barside Meets, an opportunity for yous fans to get a little bit of an insight into the world of Colchester United. And I am joined by someone who needs no introduction for a lot of yous fans, somebody who was with Colchester United for over 18 years in various roles. Matt Hudson, how are you doing?
Yeah, not so bad. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Firstly, thank you very much for coming on and sharing some insights about your time at the club. First of all, 18 and a half years at Colchester United is an incredible tenure for any role. How do you reflect on your time at the club overall?
Probably overall, I'd say with pride. I think kind of by the time I left, I was probably one of the only people left that had probably been at the old stadium that had moved to the new. And obviously the club itself changed significantly in that time. Something's good, something's bad, I guess. And I think overall, I always said when people ask me what I saw my role as, it's almost being the fan on the inside of the club sometimes and almost giving that voice to a lot of the conversations that went on. When we talk about ticketing, when we talk about cup allocations, when we talk about what should or shouldn't be in the programme, it's almost like, well, partially had my hands hat on for a lot of that time, whilst also sort of trying to give it that professional edge and reflect the club in the best light as well.
Certainly. And you mentioned that you're a Colchester United fan. How special was it to work for the club that you also support?
Yeah, it was great. It was great. I think it's funny, isn't it? With some jobs, if you have a bad day at work, you can kind of leave it in the office and not worry about it too much. But when it's your team as well, and if you get, have a bad day on a Saturday and get beaten heavily, it's hard not to let that bleed into your personal life as well. And I think as time went on across those 18 years, I got better at doing that. If we lost on the Saturday, I could still, go out on Saturday night and have a nice time and not worry about it too much. But certainly in those early days, the lines were blurred somewhat, I'd say.
Certainly, I can't imagine what that must be like where you're immersed in football 24/7, but your role sort of changed a few times over the tenure, beginning as website editor, moving into various different roles and ending up as the marketing and media manager.
Yep.
The role of a media manager has changed massively over the years. How different was the job when you first started compared to when you left it?
Oh, completely different. I think to be corrected, but I don't think Colchester United really had a full-time media or press officer in prior to myself. There were, the likes of Bernie Webber that preceded me in the past to kind of look after that more, I guess, historic version of a press officer role. But I was brought in, and it was the first time that clubs were expected to have a website. Clubs were expected to kind of have that digital presence. Makes me feel really old, but my time kind of preceded things like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, and certainly things like TikTok. And you were in that kind of hybrid role of trying to be that traditional press officer and looking after visiting press on a match day, but also trying to build that initial digital footprint. And looking at how we used to do things when I first started to when I left is crazy, really. We used to receive the proofs for the match day program via fax machine. So you come into the office on a Thursday morning or whatever, and there'd all be in a pile of papers on the floor in the office. And obviously, come the end of it, everything's by email. You're going around the country on various bits of Wi-Fi and technology. And as you say, the requirements of a media team changed so much in those 18 years.
Yeah, they did. And you mentioned those sort of elements of social media with Facebook, Twitter, and then a bit further on with Instagram and TikTok. Clubs are expected to produce huge amounts of content across all of those social media platforms, YouTube as well. I mean, how challenging is that to balance quantity, but also with quality as well?
Really tough because, certainly the clubs at Colchester's level historically would typically been a media team of one or two people. Kind of at the top level, they've got someone who's dedicated kind of social media, someone who's dedicated to the program, someone who's dedicated to press accreditation. But in a smaller club, you're expected to be all of those things and more, really. So it's really kind of tough to keep those things ticking over, and as you say, providing really good quality content. And fair play to the club in the last 3 or 4 years, particularly the output's been excellent, really, and tells the story really well from behind the scenes. And I know you spoke to Danny Cowley recently. I'm sure he sees the value in that as well, in terms of being able to communicate from the outside in and kind of let everybody know what's going on at the club. But for me personally, I think at that time it was really important. You had real day-to-day active conversations with the fan base. Historically, you might only get to hear from people by letter originally, and kind of then eventually emails were coming in, and then you had that real time conversation with supporters. And for me, it's really important to respond and be present and engage with the fan base and kind of make them feel like they were valued, really.
Yeah, and was that one of the main sort of reasonings behind the message board, the fans' message board, sort of being developed?
Yeah, I think so. I think for me, that fan's voice is really important. I think we spoke just before we started recording about actually me being that representation inside the club to kind of make sure that fan voice is heard. That when you're talking about ticketing and ticket structures and cup allocations and things like that, it's like, well, how do we do those things properly? And having some sight of that through the message board and comments coming in on Twitter and so on, it's really important to listen to those comments, but equally not jump to the tune of the people who shout the loudest. And I still follow the Col U hashtag now, and there's people who are very vocal in what they do or don't think the club is doing right. And in amongst all of that noise, there's some really important information for the club to sort of distill down and hopefully shape its decision making. And I think to varying degrees they do that, and the best clubs really do take on board that fan feedback.
Certainly, and as you say, it's very much a filtering process as well as an engagement process. You mentioned the program and how that's evolved over time. We've had a huge shift this season with the matchday program going digital. I wondered what your thoughts were on that shift and how you navigate that.
Yeah, I think I was quite sad to see it happen, and that's kind of, you see various clubs kind of going down that route over time. I think you might have changed a lot in the 5 or 6 years since I left, but I know kind of certainly the economics of producing the program works. We made a little bit of money each season, and for me, if you're pitching yourself as a family orientated club, you should be offering things like the program for kids who are coming to their first game, and people who want to have that momentum of first matches, or kind of the avid collectors who really like them. I get it. We spoke before about the demands on a small team's time, but they're still writing the program, so they're still using that time to create it. So it's a shame that they don't produce it anymore. And again, when I talk about being that filter from the inside, and I obviously wasn't involved in those conversations that culled it in the end this time around, but I probably would have fought quite strongly to try and keep it in the mix, I think.
Certainly, and I completely agree in terms of that sort of engaging a fan base across all age groups. That there will be people that are coming to their first games that want that sort of collector's item, and people that have been coming to games for years upon years that are so used to the match day experience being a particular way, and when it shifts away from that, sometimes that can create a little bit of tension amongst the fan base. There was talk originally, I think you were part of the conversation, albeit it was sort of a passing comment about the idea of a fanzine being created. Do you feel like that's something that is useful for clubs to produce?
I think so. I think the good work that you guys are doing on the podcast is a variation on that theme, isn't it? About giving the fans a voice and kind of reflecting on what's going on. And I remember speaking with a couple of the guys probably a year, 18 months ago about doing one. And you think, well, with the Cowleys in charge, it's going to be a good story happening one way or another. And could you actually imagine if we'd done the fanzine and, 1 minute you're talking about Alexandra Pato taking over the club and the next minute John Terry taking over the club, the kind of the fanzine take on those stories would have been incredible, really. And you could have probably had quite a lot of fun with some of those pieces. And actually it seemed, Robbie spoke at the forum last week about how serious the Pato bid was or wasn't, but it seemed like their people were quite willing to talk. And actually the fanzine would have potentially been a really useful vehicle for people like that to have got their story across to the fans while that process was going on. So, yeah, I think fanzines for me football's become very modern, but almost would be quite a cool retro-y type thing to return to the football fan base, really.
Yeah, certainly, and giving a bit of ownership to the fan base as well is always a good thing in my opinion. And sort of on that note, you played a significant role in the club being recognised as the EFL Family Club of the Year,
Yep.
which was a significant achievement for Colchester United. What did that achievement mean to you personally?
I guess it was a little bit of personal validation, really, because I remember the kind of the summer before, I sort of sat down with Robbie and Tim, and I said, I think we should give it a go, and almost set our stall out to try and pick up the award come the end of the season. And I remember there was myself and a couple of friends, Tom Taylor and Gavin Preston and stuff, and we were up ladders, a couple of days before the first game of the season, finishing off the painting in the family concourse, because we wanted to make sure that we could do it. And I think we ended up doing the EFL presentation afterwards to some of the other clubs, and we kind of called it Beg, Steal and Borrow, because we did achieve that by spending very little additional money. We kind of got sponsorship from the local Wicks to give us the paint, and someone else gave us pictures to put up on the walls, and we spent very little money to do it. But I feel like it's been really important to do that. The new stadium is pitched as a community stadium, so you need to do things that bring the community to you. And the under 11s for free has been a real great introduction for young people to come and watch the club. And there's a lot of people probably in the South Stand now that started coming to watch on the back of the free tickets that we introduced that season. So, yeah, I think the Family Club of the Year award for me was a personal success, but also one that reflected a lot of work from a lot of people to kind of make that happen. And I do remember that we were obviously down in London that weekend to pick up the award. And then on the Monday or Tuesday, I was at the training ground for a reserves game, and Robbie came up to me and he goes, "Oh, actually, fair play, you got that one right." It's like, it's great that we've been able to win that award. Probably also a bit of regret that having won that award, we didn't then kick on and do more. It's been kept at that same level ever since. But it felt like once we'd won the award, it was an opportunity to try a few more different things. But like we say, there's only so many hours in the week to kind of get everything done, and we kind of had to prioritise other things the following season, I guess.
Certainly, and the hours in the week and the additional money that would be needed for certain things to sort of kick onto that next level is always going to be something that's debated at any sort of level.
Yeah.
Colchester United do pride themselves on being a family club, and they do still have that culture. It's still sort of there from that time. It's sort of continued. What goes into creating that family club culture from a media and marketing perspective?
I think you have to get the engagement from the very top. So we mentioned Robbie, and he was very good at the time in terms of supporting some of that. If you can get your first team manager on board and making sure that he then cascades that down to the captain and the first team players, willing to get out and do those community visits, whether it be football in the community type stuff or just school visits and charity events and so on, having that visibility in the local community and really engaging with young supporters is really important. The pricing has to be right so the families can afford to come. And I think it was always going to be the case that once all that new housing was built around the stadium, that the club would benefit from that. And I think the combination of the Cowleys and their charisma and what they're doing on the pitch, plus the fact we've got real busy neighbourhoods just down the road now. I think from speaking to some of the guys at the club in the last year or so, that a good chunk of that new fan base, or the growth in the fan base over the last couple of years, has come from those new estates and the immediate surrounds near to the stadium, because they're families with the right disposable income, families who've got kids of the right age to come and watch football, and they can walk to the ground. So yeah, everything's kind of set up that, this season we averaged over 5,000. Everything's set up for that to continue, I think.
Yeah, and it's really positive to see how sort of the gates are increasing with the sort of with Danny and Nikki Cowley arriving, it seemed to correlate really, really well. They're really sort of keen on creating that sort of family fan culture within Colchester United, and everything seems to be moving in a really positive direction. You say about getting the management team on board. Would it have been Joe Dunn at that point that was the person to convince, or would it have been Tony Humes at that point?
Yeah, I think it's probably around that kind of time, wasn't it? And I think I've always been lucky myself that the vast majority of the managers always got on really well with. And I think one thing I always tried to do, whether it be managers or players, is that they've got their football persona, but actually underneath that there's a human being as well, and kind of if you can get to know them as a person rather than just a football manager and understand what makes them tick, then I think you kind of get a lot of other wins for things you might need in terms of that PR and media and kind of community outreach. And I say very lucky that I got to work with some managers who really kind of bought into the way that we were thinking.
Yeah, and it certainly helps when you've got the manager on board, because you can sort of I don't know, get away with maybe introducing some initiatives or getting them on board with some visits or talks that perhaps you wouldn't have done if you don't have that personal sort of relationship there. Looking back, aside from the family club of the year, what were some of your favorite moments or campaigns that you worked on during your time at the club?
Um, I think some of the most interesting things were the things that actually weren't just directly Colchester United. So you look at the fact that when we moved to the new stadium, all of a sudden we had 3 or 4 major concerts. We hosted 7 or 8 England internationals. It's like, well, actually, we're working as a club with these bigger bodies to make these things happen. So, wind the club back to when we were at Layer Road, you could never have envisaged Elton John coming to Colchester and certainly playing that stadium. But, kind of, I remember we were stood up on the TV gantry when Elton came out on stage, and hearing the crowd react to him coming out, it's just like, okay, we've done this, we've kind of created this and made it happen. And I think if you spoke to any of the concert promoters or the FA, that they've always kind of got fond recollections of working with the team behind the scenes at that time. But yeah, I think kind of those would be my big moments. Things that when you talk about people, what you did at the club, those big concerts were pretty special, really.
Yeah, there certainly were, and certainly a something that we definitely didn't expect as Colchester United fans when you look back at the Layer Road days as well. Now you've stepped away from the role, and you can view the club from a supporter perspective again, and sort of have that soul perspective. How's it been viewing the club from just that supporter side of things?
Um, I'll say it took a while to adapt. It took me a few months to come back to my first game, and it took me a few games to feel like I could get used to not being almost access all areas. I kind of was just a supporter again, I guess. I don't know, maybe it's like coming out of a long-term relationship or something, isn't it? It takes you a while to adapt not being with that person anymore. But I enjoy it now. I think I'm far enough removed from being at the club that I can just go to a game and enjoy it for what it is, and equally go on social media after the game and say what I really think, rather than having to dumb it down a little bit and kind of temper my opinions if it's been a bad day. So yeah, I think I'm always someone who's got a positive mindset on things, and we'll look for the best in any situation. And this season obviously we didn't quite make the playoffs, and you still can see some of the positives in there. But yeah, being able to just kind of go to a game and, like I said to you before, not let it bleed into my weekend. I can kind of just go home and switch off. It's not my problem if the team gets beat now. So, but it's still nice going to games. I went to MK Dons away recently. It's nice that people still remember me and still come up and say how you doing and how the family, and that the contribution, I guess, hasn't been forgotten.
No, not at all. I think for certain news fans, I think you and David are sort of synonymous with the success that we had,
Mhm.
particularly in that 05-06 season. Which is sort of a natural segue. You worked with David Gregory for such a long period, and David's still at the club, and often his work goes unnoticed by U's fans, but it's really significant, the work that he does. As someone who has worked closely with him, quite how much does David Gregory do for Colchester United?
Yeah, it's really important ambassador. I think kind of we spoke before about those relationships with managers and players and how that then makes everything else easier. David's been on the other side of that dressing room door as a player, hasn't he? So he understands what the internal pressures are like in and around a match day, and when a team might be struggling through a longer period of time, there's a certain diplomacy in terms of how you manage those relationships with managers and how you can protect them from the pressures that arise as the team's sort of struggling at the wrong end of the table. David's been there as a player as well, so he kind of gets that gist. And obviously, since I've left, there's been 2 or 3 media guys that have worked under him, and I think he'll probably be the first to admit that social media is not his bag, and probably never will be. But he's enabled and empowered those other lads to kind of crack on and really take our social media presence and that video production to a really new level, and just let them get on with that while he does the, as I say, that kind of relationship management and looking after the press and kind of keep people at arm's length when things are getting tougher, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. And just to sort of round things off, from your perspective as a supporter, how do you see next season going for Colchester United? You mentioned that this season we didn't really hit the expectations that a lot of youth fans will have had. How do you think next season's going to pan out?
It depends who's in charge, doesn't it? I think I think Robbie admitted the other day there's a good chance it might not be him at the helm come the start of next season. The reassurance was that some of those more important players have got the year options to kind of keep them involved in the club, and I'm sure Danny and Nicky have already got their shopping list, shopping list A and shopping list B, depending on what budget they end up with. I feel like York will probably potentially go straight through. They might come up and go straight through into League One, so there'll be a tough proposition next year. I think we've got every chance. I think you look at it, the last couple of seasons, we've had one of the best defences in the division. We've just been a bit shy at the other end of the pitch. If we'd have kept Micah and Bick fit this year, we probably would have been a fair bit closer to those top 7 places. Losing him particularly out of all the injured players we had, just those little moments where games were 1-0 or 1-1 or whatever, he's just got that moment of magic that can kind of turn a game in your favour. There was a lot of games where we were just, I think someone said the other day it's 15 games we haven't scored in this season. Well, probably a fair proportion of those are games that he's missed. The margins are pretty tight in that division. I do feel like it's probably quite open next year. If a new owner comes in, depends who they are, depends what their plans are. But if they keep the Cowleys in charge, you'd think we're guaranteed top half at least, and then it's how far we can kick on from there, really.
Certainly, completely agree. And the unknown of who will be in charge of Colchester United, I think will get youth fans debating throughout the summer. But Matt, thank you very much for sharing your insights and your opinions, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.
No, that's my pleasure. And just to finish with, I know it's been a better season this season because it's probably one of the first seasons since I left that people haven't missed me on Twitter and asked me to come back to the club. So we must have done well on the pitch this year.
There you have it. Thank you very much.
No, my pleasure. Thanks again.